Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm Chris. Today, we're going to have a look at the Nikon D3s. Alright, so I admit the title is a bit misleading. It's a D3 on steroids, not a D700 on steroids, but they do share a very similar sensor, so, there's that. So why are we talking about the D3s and not a D700? Well, let me hold up my D700. I don't have one. So that's why. I did in the past, but I don't have one anymore. So for this video, I do want to go over why you'd want to shoot the D3s over the D700. So let's get into it. And you might want to strap in. I think this is going to be a long video. Well, I don't think it. I can see the length of my script. It's over there. It's quite long. All right. Now let's get into it. What is the Nikon D3s? The D3s is a flagship Nikon camera, launched in October of 2009. It's a camera that was considered an incremental upgrade from the base D3. It features a full-frame CMOS sensor designed by Nikon. Manufactured by somebody, maybe Toshiba, not really sure. If you know, let me know. Now, the sensor model for the D3s is the NC81361A, and supposedly it's a reworked version of the one used in the D3 and D700, which is, and get ready for it, the NC81338L. Awesome name. And all this tweaking allows it to have a base ISO range of 200 to 12,800, a solid one stop more than the D3 and D700, and it has expansion options that allow it to go to ISO 100 and 102,400 ISO. Shutter speeds range from 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second, with a flash sync at 1/250th of a second. It'll do 9 FPS for up to 30 RAWs in the FX mode, and this AF module is the Multicam 3500 FX. The metering is done by a 1005 pixel array, referred to as the 3D color matrix metering 2. And the rear of the camera has a 3-inch color, clearly LCD, with 921K dots. More importantly, the finder is 100% finder at 0.7% magnification. So it's nice, it's big, it's bright, and it's everything that is right. Now, back to the LCD, the camera also features live view. And it shoots 720p video. Wow. The media storage is dual CF card slots, and with the battery, this camera weighs in at 1,420 grams, roughly 1.42 plano. Wow, a bit weighty. Now, speaking of batteries, when this camera was new, the battery was rated at over 4,000 shots on a single charge. That's a lot. Now, at launch, this camera came in at $5,199 US, roughly $7,610 US in future dystopia dollars, or roughly 10,400 Canadian maple syrup tokens. Shooting with the D3s, operation and feel. We're going to start with the ergonomics. So this is a pro body. It is a flagship camera after all, and it looks and feels the part. Build quality is exceptionally good. Body is made from a magnesium alloy with nice rubber grips all around. I admit, on my copy I did end up having to re-glue a bunch of the grips. Mine was fairly worn. But otherwise, it is an excellent camera to hold, and the grip itself, they are fairly deep and comfortable. If you couldn't already tell, this camera has integrated vertical grip, and it also has weather sealing. So in dust and rain, you're good to go, assuming you have an appropriately sealed lens. Now, this camera also has a nice feature-packed, top display over here. And there it is with the illumination. It might be hard to see. It is a teal-ish color. And it also has a smaller sub-display underneath your main display. And they show a couple things, your ISO, image quality, white balance, that kind of stuff. And again, it is also backlit with the teal color. Again, fairly nice. Not as good as the Canon Blue, but pretty good. The control layout on the D3s is nearly perfect. I think it's a tiny bit less perfect than our gold standard, the D200, but pretty close to it. There are definitely more buttons on the D3s as it's a bigger body. And, over time, I think I'd probably get to know and love the use of all of them. However, I think there are a couple things that could be improved. But first, we'll start with the good. As with all other, Nikon cameras of the era, all the controls are really well placed so that you kind of naturally, don't even really think and just act and move command dials, press buttons, and do things. You can mostly operate the camera almost entirely looking through the finder. And you don't normally have to lift up and look at the back of the camera. So, many points on Nikon for that. Honestly, the only thing that I think the D200 does a bit better than the D3s is things like changing the ISO. I get on the back of this camera, you have your ISO button over here. And it is just, I think, not as good a placement as on the D200, where it would normally be on this top dial over here. Instead, what we have on D3s is a lock button. I personally don't find it very useful, because I don't think I've ever knocked settings on the D3s. I get that the ISO button is kind of probably close to the sub-display because the sub-display has the value there, so you can look and change, but I find it more natural to change ISO up here. Again, probably because I'm just used to doing it on the D200. But, that's just my opinion. Now, the other things that I think probably could have been done is probably a bit better ganging up button functions. For example, camera has also an info button here, which I think probably could have been omitted and ganged up with the OK button or something, because it just feels like there are a little too many buttons in some cases. Additionally, the vertical grip controls are pretty well mirrored, but they're not perfectly well mirrored, because on your regular operation this way, you have your AEL, AFL lock button over here. And instead, when you turn it over, if you wanted to do that, you'd have to reach your thumb all the way this way, because this is a live view button, which not quite as useful. Again, maybe that could have been swapped over with the info button, who knows. But all in all, excellent ergonomics all around. My little gripes are fairly minor. But, on that note, I have a question. And I know Nikon isn't the only brand to do this, but it has the quality button, which lets you change what you want to shoot, RAW, JPEG size, that kind of stuff. Does anyone actually ever use this? I've seen it on my Pentax K5. I don't know, maybe it's just me, because I only shoot RAWs, so I've never been in the middle of shooting and then thought, it's time to change from RAW to JPEG, or time to just add the JPEGs in. I don't know. I've never really had a snap decision change mid shooting that I gotta switch formats. But tell me in the comments below if you have. So I think might just be me. But back to the camera. So let's talk live view. This camera does have it, and its implementation is a tiny bit basic with some confusing names. So for some reason they split up live view into two kind of modes: handheld mode, tripod mode, and the differences are kind of as follows. In handheld mode, when you press your AF on or half press your shutter, the camera will drop the mirror and use the phase detect module to autofocus. In tripod mode, you'll get contrast detect, so the mirror won't bounce up and you will not, or sorry, the mirror won't drop back down and you won't get autofocus via AF module. You get, first gen live view contrast detect, which is quite bad. But, overall, for a first gen live view system, it's actually not bad. You can punch in, see if I can pull that up. Boop, boop. And, okay. So here is the live view. And I'm gonna, it's gonna be hard to see, but it is now very punched in. You hold your magnify button here and you can punch in or out. So that is very in. So you got some pretty useful live view functions. And the frame rates when you're in live view actually aren't terrible given the camera's age. Yes, if you are punching in, expect that you're not gonna get full frame rates in dark situations. But I do find that even in poor lighting, like where we're shooting right now, you get a pretty consistent frame rate and it's fairly useful. So kudos to Nikon for this early gen live view. All right, menu diving on the D3s is overall pretty good. It's your classic Nikon menu system, generally well laid out with a lot of categories, and you got your, main categories on your side there and your options on this part of the display with a couple sub menus in between. Overall, navigation and layout is pretty great. You don't need to go too deep into the menus to find something. Now, speaking of menus, when you are looking at the back of the display, you'll notice it's a pretty good one, especially for the era. 921K dots is pretty solid. Now, it ain't the 2 million dots that you get on modern times, but still it's pretty good. Image review tends to be fairly crisp, and things look reasonably accurate. Now, additionally, this being a flagship camera, it can also meter any older AI and newer lenses. On top of that, the camera does also offer your focusing aids in the finder, which will activate and give you an idea of how to focus either, closer or farther away to achieve focus where your focus point is. Now, this is pretty handy when you're shooting using the OVF and you have a standard focusing screen. So, good stuff. Now, last thing I do want to mention is this camera also has sensor cleaning, and that's a really nice thing to have for these older cameras. Image quality and autofocus. As I said, the D3s sensor is a variant of the D3 and D700 sensor, being tweaked for better high ISO performance. So that means that the resolution is at a 12.1 megapixel amount. And I know that sounds a bit small. And I think even at the time, it felt a bit low. I know the D3X was already out and it had a 24 megapixel sensor, which is still pretty contemporary today. The 5D2, again, was out at the same time with 21 megapixels. But you have to remember the D3S was supposed to be the high-speed full-frame shooter. So you got, a smaller pixel count, but more frames per second. And that's actually totally fine. These 12.1 megapixels are quite good quality. You can do your, pretty good size prints. You can do a bit of cropping in, and the sensor resolves very good detail. The sensor itself is actually, considered fairly chunky in its pixelage, with the pixel pitch being 8.42 microns, similar to the 5D Classic D700 obviously. Now, again, sensor is a CMOS. Sadly, there isn't much in the way of full-frame CCD cameras, unless you go either Leica or Leica/Kodak. However, this CMOS sensor in here is an excellent unit, and I think if you enjoy the D700 output, you'll probably like this. Now, I personally don't have any issues with the way that this camera renders any of the images. I think that the files are pretty malleable, and at the time, the camera had a fairly reasonable dynamic range. Even now, I don't think it's considered too bad. I mean, I think it's technically like better performing than the EOS RP that I had, and that camera is significantly newer. Now, I'd be confident shooting this camera in most scenarios right now. One thing this camera does excel at is high ISO. They did, after all, tune the sensor to make it better for that. Now, part of that is probably due to the fact that the pixels are quite chunky, and again, part of that is that magic Nikon sensor tweakage. And the combination of these two actually mean that for high ISO, this camera is still extraordinarily competitive. I know, we're gonna have a look at some examples just so I can show you, but it is truly impressive for its age how well these high ISO shots look. I'd happily shoot this in the non-expanded ISO range any day of the week, especially given modern noise reduction software. Sure, at high ISO, the dynamic range kind of drops, but it's actually, it drops on par with modern shooters of the now times. Let's get into the topic of autofocus. At the time that this camera was released, it had the top spec multicam 3500 FX. Now, it doesn't compete with modern cameras subject detect, doesn't have a trillion phase detect points on its sensor, so it can't track spider ballets. However, this unit is extraordinarily capable, even to this day. Its array works pretty well, and it works in conjunction with Nikon's metering system to broadly give the camera an idea of what the scene actually is and how to generally, focus and make things work. And I find that it focuses very quickly. Everything snaps in quite fast, and especially when you're using any of the, cross-type sensors, of which this camera has many. Now, last year, at the time of this recording, I took this camera with me on a relay running event that I was doing with work. And I was able to do quite a bit of shooting, tracking runners, and generally that kind of stuff was not an issue. I know it's not the most complicated sporting scene, but it's the example that I got, and the photos turned out quite nice. At the time, I'd also brought with me my EOS RP, and I'll be honest, I think I got a better hit rate using the D3s than when I had the RP. On the RP, I think I was shooting the 35mm USM lens, the IS one that's meant for RF, and on my D3s, I was primarily shooting with the 50mm 1.4. But yeah, the focus kept up with all the stuff that I did. I even took it out on some fairly poopy rainy days and shot with this, and it was overall great. I'm happily able to place my confidence in the AF module on this camera. I would imagine that, doing modern sporting events, you'd be pretty well equipped to get some excellent epic shots. Now, with that AF system on this camera, we are able to get a solid 9 FPS in full frame mode, so let's give that a listen. Oh, let's see. I'll just boop. Pretty great. Now, I think that shutter noise on the camera has a excellent ka-chunk. It's well dampened as well by the heavy body, so it doesn't really transmit that much through the camera. Now, it is a bit loud if you are concerned about that. It has a quiet mode as well, and let's give that a go. So, with this mode, you can take your photo, hold it, then move away to another area. And when you let go, the mirror will drop back down. So there you have it. It has a quiet shutter mode. Now, aside from this time, I never really use it, but it is there. So the D3s does indeed do videos. 720p. Now, before we have a look, I just wanted to have a quick chat about it. It is Nikon's first full-frame DSLR capable of shooting video. It's not the first Nikon DSLR to do that. That's the D90. But at the time that this was made, it could do 720p for up to 5 minutes. The only frame rate option I believe at this mode is 24p. Oddly enough, given this relatively limited video output, it has a mic input. So that's kind of nice. And when you're in your video recording mode, it even supports contrast detect AF. That being said, that might not be as useful as it sounds, as contrast detect AF at this time was quite bad. Also, there were not really a lot of Nikon, there weren't any Nikon lenses optimized for video. Even the Nikon version of ultrasonic, whatever, was you could hear that if you had to rack the focus quite a bit and the AF was going. But you'll definitely hear it using the screw-driven lenses. So, AF at this time, you gotta give them credit for doing it. It's early times DSLR video, so cool stuff, but not super useful. That being said, I assume that if you're buying the D3s at this point, you're probably not using it for video. But let's have a look at a clip anyways. Do I recommend the D3s? Generally, yes. Especially if you're having a hard time finding a D700, which you might, given the relative surge in popularity of this camera. Now, if you want a classic full-frame DSLR at 12 megapixels, it's hard to go wrong with one of these. Although I do admit, the D3s is currently going for a little higher than your average D700 selling point, at around 400 USD. Now, that being said, for your extra money, I do think it's generally worth it. You have a pretty nice build, and you got really, really good high ISO performance, and if you need it, you got that really nice 9 FPS full frame shooting frame rate. It's quite speedy. Now, that being said, if you are concerned about the size, there's a good reason to go for the D700. It's much easier to casually pick it up and just go out. I do admit sometimes I have a hard time packing this into my modern camera bags. It is, after all, quite a square. But if you are having a hard time finding a D700, or you just want something that is a little more hefty, this is a great option. Other bonuses that come with this over the D700 are your viewfinder being quite a bit nicer, which I think is a pretty good plus, especially if you're planning to use manual glass on this camera. It's really good for that. Now, generally, I know I said this camera does videos. Wouldn't recommend getting it if you're trying to get into video. 720p, kind of limited. That being said, there are a couple things to look out for. Even if you're looking for a D700, this is a pretty valid tip. High shutter counts. This camera, my camera, it has about 500,000 shots on it, which is a great many. This shutter on the D300, on the D3s, is rated for 300K, which is quite a lot. And mine is quite a bit past it and still going strong. So, the 300, it's not like just going to shatter at that point, but keep that in mind. A lot of these D3s were, used professionally and in sporty situations, so they may have fairly high shutter counts. But otherwise, great camera and a great alternative to the D700 at a tiny bit extra cost, but with many extra benefits. And, bigger size. But yeah, I enjoy mine. So if you can tell by my direct phrasing, I'll say it again. I like my D3s. I don't think that, I'm going to be looking for a D700 anytime soon, unless one pops up for an aggressively low price. But what do you think of the D3s? Do you have one? Do you want one? Do you not care? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.